Hello, welcome all. We are here for Think450. This is something organised by the Southwest Gospel Partnership. My name is Tom Underhill. I work for the partnership, and Think450 is a series of online sessions which we describe as a short, sharp shot. I have had to practice that. 50 minutes strictly of interesting content. We get interesting people to come talk to us about interesting things, areas of theology and ministry, and the promises that we are all done within 50 minutes. So it slots either in at the start of your day or into your lunch break, and we go on. So we kind of keep it snappy. And in aid of that goal, I'm going to hand straight over to Dan Strange. Dan is the, I think, director of Crosslands Forum, but we'll allow him a couple of minutes to explain that if you would like to, and former vice principal of Oak Hill College, and is going to be talking to us about Making Faith Magnetic, his new book, and some very interesting material. So Dan, over to you.
Great, wonderful to be with you. I was saying this is a very innovative way of doing things, and yeah, it's great. So I'll take a minute just to do a bit of background. I need to have my 24 minutes left. So yeah, my name's Dan Strange. I am the director of Crosslands Forum, which is a kind of a new centre for cultural engagement and mission as part of Crosslands training, which you may have heard of. And yes, previously I was the director of Oak Hill Theological College for 16 years, and lots of friends in Southwest Gospel Partnership. Great to be with you. We've just moved up to Gateshead, and we're getting used to life there. And yeah, that's a bit about me. So I've written a book. I'm going to share my screen here, and so you can follow me. And this is a book called Making Faith Magnetic. And I'm going to try and speak to you and follow this outline at the same time. So I'm presuming, Tom, that everyone can see that. Can you see that? Okay, that's great. Okay. So this is a book that was written because I did a previous book called Plugged In, which was about how do we engage culture. And this is really the sequel or follow-up, which gives a bit more flesh on the bones, really, in terms of how do we do engagement, cultural engagement. And it's based upon the work of a Dutch Reformed missiologist called Johan Herman Bavinck, who's the nephew of a more well-known theologian called Herman Bavinck, very confusing. And this guy, J.H. Bavinck, was a missionary in Indonesia in the 1940s and 50s, ended up teaching in the Free University of Amsterdam. And his framework, I think, for understanding or engaging culture is very helpful. So I'll be saying a little bit more about that. So the book is about how do we get traction in engaging with people who have very little time in our post-secular context, our post-Christendom context, to hear the things of God, the Bible, Jesus, the gospel, faith. And yeah, it's a book about how do we get traction theologically and in our apologetics and evangelism and in our discipleship. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a kind of a whistle-stop tour of the book, and then hopefully that will whet your appetite to go and buy it for a Christmas present for someone. Or even if you enjoy my voice, which not many people do as the Estuary Essex accent comes through, you can get it on Audible as well, with me reading the book. So there you go. What a treat to give to your family this Christmas. Okay, so foundations, theological foundations, very important. We're to look at the world through the word. And I want to imagine that often we think, let's think of the relationship between God and human beings as a cosmic game of hide and seek. And in the story that we've told ourselves, God is the one who is hiding, and we've looked for him everywhere. Yuri Gagarin went up to space, came back down, and allegedly said to the Russian authorities, there's no one there. And in fact, God's found such a great place to hide that it's easier to think that God doesn't exist for many. Or he's not interested, or he doesn't affect my life in any way that would make a difference. Now, as we look at the word, we see that there is a cosmic game of hide and seek, but actually God is not hiding. And in Romans 1:18-32, we see that very clearly. God has made himself manifest. All people know God, and human beings know. God has revealed himself to all human beings through everything that has been made, including, and supremely, I suppose, in ourselves as image bearers of God. We kind of emanate the revelation of God. We are a revelation of God. Now, in Romans 1, there's a very interesting section there that talks about, Paul says, God has revealed his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. And I spent a whole day at Oak Hill once in the Romans commentaries, and pretty much none of the commentators really know why Paul focuses on those two characteristics, why eternal power and divine nature. And this guy Bavinck, I think, has some great things to say on that. He says, look, God has revealed to all humanity with his eternal power that we are dependent upon him. He is the creator. He's the creator. We are created. And there's a sense that we are dependent upon him. It's this sense of dependence. Divine nature, well, the fact that God has a nature, that God is not an it or something, but a someone. This is the idea of accountability. We are accountable to the one who created us. So is the idea that God has revealed his invisible characteristics, his eternal power and divine nature, that we are dependent and accountable to him. That is what God has revealed. And at some level, we all know that. We are dependent and accountable. Now, not to give the game away, but when we suppress the truth, when we substitute the truth for idols, other God substitutes, we don't lose that kind of hardwiring of dependence and accountability. It's just that we direct it to other things. We still at some level know we are dependent because we are not God. And we sometimes know that we're accountable, but we don't know to whom. But that sense of accountability or even responsibility is still there. Now, hold that thought because we'll come back to that in a bit. So God has revealed himself. We're made to relate to God. What do? Well, we suppress the truth or repress it. We substitute it for all kinds of other things. So there's a sense, and here's the complexity of messy human beings. All human beings know God and don't know him at the same time because truth has been suppressed. We become ignorant even though we know. And we replace God for other things, God substitutes, which the Bible calls idolatry. Remember, idolatry is created things that are inflated to act as gods when we have suppressed the knowledge of God. So that's some of the theological, anthropological framework to do with human beings. Now, where do we see that kind of model of messiness, of suppression and knowledge? Well, Acts 17 is a model exposition. I think these passages in Acts are there as exemplary passages for us to learn from. And we see, of course, in Acts 17 that Paul is due in Athens. He's not even meant to be there. He's waiting for his friends. He says that the city is submerged in idolatry. The only time a city is described like that in the book of Acts. And he has a kind of he's distressed. I mean, it's a bit slightly British way of saying it. Literally, he has a paroxysm. He's deeply repulsed by the idolatry, not because he thinks he's better, but because he has a zeal for God's glory. Now, what does he do? Well, he doesn't say, well, I'm just going to wait for my friends. I'm just going to leave them. He does what he always does. He goes to the synagogues, goes to the marketplaces. He's talking about Jesus and the resurrection, and they say, we do not know what you're talking about. You're a babbler. Literally, you are a seed picker. You're picking up ideas we don't understand. So they haul him in front of the Areopagus. And Paul says, people of Athens, I see you're very religious. Now, that word religious is really interesting because it's the only time it appears in that form anywhere. And it could mean Paul is affirming them in their idolatry, or he's affirming them in their religiosity. I don't think it can mean that in a wholly positive sense because he's just nearly being ill because of idolatry and he's going to call them to repent at the end of the passage. So however contextual Paul is being, including quoting their own poets, wandering around their objects of worship, Paul is not simply affirming them, but he's not completely disregarding them to say, there's no point of contact here, because he says, I've wandered around your objects of worship and I see that you worship an unknown God, as in you've got thousands of gods already, but you're hedging your bets for the God that you don't know about. Well, Paul basically says, the God that I'm going to talk about from now on, Jesus, is not that God, but I have to start somewhere. So he builds out. Interesting what one writer says about that word religious here. It's not beyond possibility that Paul cleverly chose this term precisely for the sake of its ambiguity. His readers would wonder whether the good or the bad sense was being stressed by Paul, and Paul would be striking a double blow. People cannot eradicate a religious impulse within themselves, as the Athenians demonstrate. And yet this good impulse has been degraded by rebellion against the living and true God, as the Athenians also demonstrate. Although people do not acknowledge it, they are aware of their relation and their accountability to the living and true God who created them. But rather than come to terms with him and his wrath against their sin, they pervert the truth, and in this they become ignorant and foolish. Notice there that quotation, although people do not acknowledge it, they are aware of their relation and accountability to him. Back to Romans 1, invisible qualities. So there's a sense in which the worship of the unknown God is exactly what Romans 1 is talking about people who know that they are dependent and accountable, but they suppress that and they substitute it with other things. And I think that's what Paul's getting at when he quotes from their poets, as some of your poets say, in him we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring. Paul's not affirming their worldviews there, but he's recognizing a suppressed truth, as it were. And that's messy. So here's the thing at the beginning here. The Bible talks about all human beings as knowing God and not knowing him, running to him and running away from him at the same time. And the framework that I develop in Making Faith Magnetic is based upon that foundation. So this guy, J.H. Bavinck, he's living in Java, now called Indonesia. And he says this: it appears that humanity always and everywhere has fallen back on definite ideas and presumptions, and that these ideas and presumptions always resurface in surprising ways wherever they may have been temporarily repressed for various reasons. There is a universal religious consciousness that remains indestructible in the midst of all disturbing and confusing developments. And Bavinck calls this framework, this religious consciousness, he says they're these like direction signals, or what he says are magnetic points that human beings are always drawn to. Not that they think about them consciously, but the way we live our lives is an answer to those 5 magnetic points. And I think these magnetic points are a great framework for engaging culture, engaging people, because it's saying at the end of the day, if human beings are made in the image of God, which they all are, everyone displays at some level these magnetic points. We may have to be creative in the way that we excavate them. They won't be found in traditional religious categories, but our lives are responses to the magnetic points. And so what my book is about, Bavinck relates the magnetic points to Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, other religions. What I try and do is say, well, let's take that framework and apply it to your average 21st century secular Westerner, Brit, I suppose. So my examples are not the ones that Bavinck gives, but I update the categories and I update the examples. And all those are the examples. This is the encouragement for you, is that all the examples that I give in the book many of them have been given to me by students at Oak Hill or Crosslands, or people I've been contacting in churches. I mean, this was Word Alive material years ago. So you can do this. And so the idea is as we start to look at the world through this framework, this might give us the traction we need. So in the 10 minutes I've got left, let me just very quickly give you a whistle-stop tour of these magnetic points. They're all, they don't compartmentalize them. They're all facets on the one human person who knows God and doesn't know God. And I've given them my own titles, and they've been illustrated a little bit by our learning designer at Crosslands, who's a very good illustrator. So the first one is totality. Is there a way to connect? This is the question that human beings ask. And it's the idea that we are small cogs in a much bigger machine, that we know we struggle between thinking, on the one hand, we're very small and insignificant as human beings, but when we connect with something bigger, we find significance through belonging. And we enjoy what might be called a communal awareness, and we crave that connection. And after we've experienced it, we feel at a loss. And in the book, I kind of give all kinds of examples: social media, LGBTQ, fan clubs, Comic-Con, stadium experiences, family trees, dating agencies, all the ways in which we try to look for connection, to find significance and belonging in some way. So while people might not say that they're religious, I'm arguing people are always looking for connection at some level. And it's that idea of significance and insignificance. So that's totality, a way to connect. Then norm, is there a way to live? There is a vague sense that there are rules that need to be obeyed. There's standards and codes that come outside of ourselves, and that these are ordered in some way, and we have a responsibility to live up to those norms. Again, I'm not saying it in our culture it's the 10 Commandments, but everyone does have a norm somewhere, rules, standards that need to be policed and which people can stick to or slip from. And again, in the book, I give the example of a friend of mine. A lady came into a shop. Can I have a drink here? Yes, says the guy. The lady says, are your straws paper or plastic? He says paper. And she says, I'm so glad I can drink here. So the norm there is that if you have a paper straw, I can have a drink here. Even those cultures that are try to be countercultural still have their own rules. So I give the example of goths, who apparently, if you're an experienced goth, you can wear baby pink. But if you don't know the rules and you wear it at the wrong time, you're shown to be an outsider. So interesting, goths often want to be countercultural, but they're countercultural in the same way, as in there's conformity in being non-conformist, as it were. So we all have rules. And I think cancel culture is about those rules and what happens when you break them. So deliverance then, the third point, is there a way out? We know, everyone knows the world is not as it should be. Something's gone wrong. The issue is that no one can agree what the problem is, let alone whether there's a solution. This is a kind of a romantic notion of either a paradise lost or a paradise to be gained. And we all have deliverances, whether it's mini deliverances to get us through the day. And that can be as basic as substance abuse or, relying on something else. Or it could be bigger deliverances. How do we escape death, or how do we think about those things? Even there's deliverance from thinking about deliverance. The example I give is a pastor friend of mine who's counseling two 30-year-old guys in his church who are addicted to the mobile phone game Clash of Clans just because they don't want to deal with life. So they're being delivered from having to think about it even. So in some ways, everyone is thinking about deliverance. And then fourthly, destiny, a way we control. This is a really fascinating one. It's a constant philosophical question that you see every day at street level. The relationship between, on the one hand, we're told or we think that we're free. We have freedom. We have free agency. You can be who you want to be. You can do whatever you want to do. And we then flip-flop between that and thinking, I don't have any agency. I'm just a victim. It's fate. I can't do anything else. I'm stuck. And we kind of struggle between those two things. On the one hand, we think that we've got freedom. On the other hand, we think there's a fate that's kind of telling us what to do or making things happen. I go into all kinds of like really interesting examples there. The biggest one being a friend of mine in an office where you couldn't say it's quiet today because that would kind of jinx this, and the office then the session would get busy. And I thought this was crazy. And then I realized it's everywhere. My son, who's a policeman, says on the radio, you never say it's quiet tonight. You just say it's Q. And in accident and emergency services, I've seen I know not lots of doctors who say it's exactly the same thing. So this idea that there is some malevolent force making phones busy or not, and you mustn't kind of provoke them. I mean, you could say, well, people don't really believe that, but they take it very seriously. So this idea of destiny, is there a way we control? But it could be more mundane. It's the idea that I'm stuck. I'm never going to be able to get a house because I'm stuck in my particular rung on the ladder. And how do I get onto that? Or my genes made me do it. GENES rather than my jeans I'm wearing. Or, my upbringing made me do it. It's that idea that we don't have any agency, but we're told from an early age, you can do whatever you want to do. And then the final magnetic point, I suppose, is the super magnetic point. In Bavinck's time, I think he'd say people start with thinking about, is there a God or a higher power? Actually, in our secular context, I think this is the last thing we come to. It's as we ask these other questions, who connects us, who gives us the rules, who delivers us, who is in control, that we start asking this question, is there a way beyond? Is there a reality beyond reality? Now, we would understand that as being God, but for lots of people in our post-Christian context, it could be spirituality or transcendence or anything like that. So we're still dealing, we have to go deeper. But it's that idea of the more we push into the other points, the more we ask that question. And again, lots of examples of secular religious experiences that people had. A friend of mine felt something when they went to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The example in the book I give is this idea of champing. I don't know whether you've heard of this. Churches that are derelict or are not being used, people can go and camp there for a fee. And the idea is if you camp in a church, you'll get a sense of the history of the place. So the ITV report that I watched was a lady who wanted her kids to wake up in the morning with light coming through the stained glass window because it would give them an experience. Completely secularized experience, but it's that idea of waking the ghost. And I think there's a lot of evidence that actually our secular culture is like that. This idea that the secular is haunted. Julian Barnes is a writer he's an atheist. He wrote a book a few years ago called Nothing to be Scared of, about dying. And he starts the book, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. And I think that's a very common understanding in a culture that's been kind of had a Christian background. People don't believe it, but they kind of, in a certain sense, they wish it was true. They wish it was true, even though they can't believe it is. So they're the magnetic points. Now, 4 minutes left. The answer, or the way that the magnetic points are answered, of course, is in the Lord Jesus. But the way that happens is through this model of cultural engagement that I outline in my other book, Plugged In, called Subversive Fulfillment. So the idea here is that the gospel always connects and confronts at the same time. Again, go and read Plugged In. 1 Corinthians 1 is, I base it on 1 Corinthians 1, really. We preach Christ crucified, a foolish message to the world. But Paul still outlines two ethnic groups in that passage, Jews and Greeks. Jews look for power, Greeks look for wisdom. That's their worldview. That's their hopes and dreams are in two different things. And at the end there, Paul says, Jesus is the power of God. He is the wisdom of God in precisely the opposite way that Jews and Greeks expect it. So that's how I think the gospel relates to culture. It both confronts and connects. So in the magnetic points, Jesus is the way that we connect, but in precisely the opposite way that we seek connection. or Jesus is the way that we live. Jesus is a kind of conservative and progressive at the same time. He doesn't just give us the standard, but he saves us when we fall from standards. Jesus is for moral certainty, but he hates hypocrisy. Jesus is not a virtue signaler. So in that sense, there's a way in which Jesus appeals both to conservatives and progressives. Jesus is the way out. Jesus is the way that we have deliverance, not just from daily deliverances, but deliverance from death. Jesus is the way we control. You know, when I used to get a taxi in Southgate in London, invariably it was a Muslim driver with an evil eye hanging down. And I can say, I don't deny there's evil powers, but I believe in a loving Heavenly Father and the Lord Jesus, who is Lord over all evil powers. I don't believe that the plan for my life is blind fate, but I believe that God has a plan, even though I have agency and I can flourish under his plan. I have responsibilities. I'm not just a victim. And of course, then Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way beyond. So what the book then tries to do is to say, how do we listen to people and try to connect their story when they're manifesting these magnetic points with our story of the gospel? And the last bit of the book should be the first bit, because actually, how do we stay magnetic? We're pulled away by other things. We're pulled away in our own discipleship to think that there are other ways to connect than Christ, or there's other ways of living, or there's other deliverances, or there's other ways of, like, basically saying, well, God's not in control, or God's got it in for me. So how do we stay magnetic? How do we stay stuck to Christ? And I go into ways that we do that. Very traditional ways, like coming under the word and sacrament, being together, all the normal church stuff that we do, which is so important. How are we remagnetized? And then how do we go into the world to be magnets for others? And then how are we attractive? And how do we point people to Christ? So that's the book, 25 minutes, 50, 25 down. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. That was great. So absolutely, over to anyone. Just unmute and ask a question if you like to. You can pop it in the chat if you prefer, and we'll keep it free flowing for 20, 25 minutes. If you're still collecting your thoughts, I can go. Dan, you mentioned some of the kind of practical ways that people could try and put this into practice, like, you know, trying to lead a diversity group, for example, with some of this material framing discussion. Have you had any feedback of people using it in practical ways yet, or is it a bit early?
Oh yeah, well, I think at the end of the book, I give an email address, which I started doing when I started teaching the material, where people have been sending in examples over the last few years. So I'm trying to collect a directory. And yeah, I think when you start looking at the world like this, I hope it'll be a bit of like an earworm, that where you say, oh, I saw this article the other day and it reminded me of this, or my friend said this, it reminded me of this magnetic point. So it's just trying to get us into the framework of understanding it. My goal, my dream is that, and it started happening a little bit, is that people take the framework and they try and contextualize it in their own contexts. So, you know, last week I was speaking at Gaffcon Island for some reason. So talking about what does this mean for Northern Ireland and the Republic? Very different contexts, very different ways the magnetic points are manifested. So in rural churches in the South, the connection is often through the land. I mean, land almost has an Old Testament sense of importance, permanence. Whereas I was speaking to a group yesterday where the issue is transitoriness. People are lonely because people are always moving on. So you see how I want churches to take the material and talk in their local churches about what do these points mean to your own context. And you can go really granular. You know, what does it mean for the Southwest? What does it mean for your own part of the Southwest? I mean, I've done it. I did a group of pastors in Manchester. What does it mean for Manchester identity? What does it mean for Newcastle identity? What does it mean for Bristol identity? And that's how we're getting traction with people, because those identities where people come from are very important in how we then relate the gospel to them. So that's how I would love it to be used very practically as we come together with the framework to say, right, in my church, we're going to discuss what does this mean for me and what does it mean for the people around me who are in a particular context. And I think that is very specific, whether you're north, south, east, west, ethnic background, age, rural, urban. That's the importance of context. And that's none other than Paul wandering around the objects of worship. That's what we're called to do. And the answer is always, I mean, again, I'm not talking about a different gospel or something kind of, I'm talking about the gospel, but the way that we communicate it and shape it into the context. You know, Jews look for power, Greeks look for wisdom. What does your average Bristolian look for? And then how do we kind of contextualize? And I think this framework, this scaffold is important to get us thinking about that, to try and get that traction. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Firstly, are we allowed to have a copy of that thing you were showing?
Yeah, great. If I send it to Tom, then you send it on or whatever. Yeah.
Brilliant. Also, I was just wondering whether there was whether you've come across a sixth candidate, or or are there only 5?
Oh, brilliant!
Or do you think there are others, or can we kind of try and fit them all in?
Great question.
And the relationship between them as well. Sometimes I feel like there's some kind of overlap, isn't there?
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, great question. So I'm quite happy with the 5. I mean, but basically because it's based on the work of Bavinck, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And actually, I do think the 5 do cover, if we're linking it back to Romans 1, eternal power and divine nature, the dependence accountability thing, I think those 5 are pretty comprehensive. I mean, I'm very open to other suggestions of points, but I think they cover that human experience. And yeah, you're right. There's an internal dynamic that's really interesting. I think totality and destiny go together. And I think norm and deliverance go together. And then the higher power is kind of the way that answers all of them. So it's always, we have a need to connect. Okay, what or who could connect us? Where do we get norms from? Who is going to deliver us, or what's going to deliver us, if anything? So I do think there's an internal kind of dynamic that's very interesting. And a lot of it is around kind of the fate and freedom, or that or do we have agency or not? So that's a great question. But yeah, I mean, I'm very open. It's not meant to be it's an artificial scaffold, I think, coming out of expounding scripture. And in that sense, though, I wouldn't want to see it as a kind of an imposition on the text. I think it comes out of how the Bible describes human beings from Genesis to Revelation. But I think there are some teaching passages like Romans 1, which are very informative, seminal, I suppose. But that's why at the end of the book, there's a section on preaching. Do you remember that the Puritans used to have these amazingly elaborate preaching grids, like Baxter would have, how to apply a passage in 50 ways to a congregation or something. And I think there's something about this framework that I think could be quite helpful. Not that you'd mention it in a sermon at all, but as a scaffold to say, okay, I'm preaching on this passage. What might be the magnetic point that kind of comes up here that I could then kind of make sticky with the congregation to apply? And I think they should come out naturally, because I think it's just talking about how we're made. So the Bible is talking about real human beings all the time. So that might be helpful in preaching, to use this scaffold, this framework. Of course, like any scaffold, when you've constructed something, you can the scaffold is redundant in some ways, but as a way to get us to frame particular issues, to connect with people. So that's how I'd answer those questions. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great.
Dan, can I just ask, on a one-to-one situation, say you're sitting next to someone in a bus or on a park bench or something, you want to explore, don't you, where a magnetic point is relevant to them.
Yes.
You don't really know to start with. So is it very, what's your technique in sort of?
Yeah, great question, Adrian. Thank you. So I think, again, this isn't meant to be a kind of a magic bullet or a formula. I think it's trying to start to try and get connection with people, even at a conversation. I mean, look, at the end of the day, for people to talk about their things like what they think the norm is in their life or connection or those points, I think there is a certain, not vulnerability, but I think you need to know people a little bit, I think, for them to start getting to this level, which is why knowing non-Christians well for them to be able to trust you to speak is so important. So now that doesn't rule out, of course, the opportunities we have in one-off conversations. Of course it doesn't. But I think given that people are quite suspicious of religion anyway, or Christianity, there needs to be a certain amount of trust. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is always, and again, we're not very good at this, it's kind of listening to what people say. Don't, please, Lord, pray that my tongue will not start wagging too soon. But I think it is trying to ask questions that might then elicit a response that we could then say, oh yeah, that is, we're thinking mentally, that is a point of connection. People do think that family is so important, or they do have standards or norms. And then I think it's the opportunity then, if we get asked a question, or for us to kind of lead the question, to be able to say what we think about that. And I think that is then pointing to Jesus Christ. So I think it is, for example, for someone who really is fearful of something or fate or some force, to be able to say, well, look, I believe in a loving Heavenly Father. I believe in someone who has conquered death. Or I think so again, you're giving Christian answers, but in a way that relates, because you've done a little bit of analysis mentally as to, okay, yeah, this is this magnetic points in terms of they've fallen into this particular bucket on an issue. So it's meant to be kind of refining what might be good gospel conversations already. It's not meant to be a completely new way of doing things. It's meant to be a kind of a fine-tuning tool that might be helpful if people are thinking, do you know what? People never come up to me and say, I feel under the wrath of God today. How on earth do I talk about Jesus? Because they have no interest. I mean, that's the thing about apologetics today. It's not really about objections people have to Christianity, because in a sense, when people have an objection, at least they're engaging. The fact is, people just don't seem interested at all. How do you get their interest in anything that we would want to say? And this is giving us an encouragement to say, if the Bible is right about human beings, and I think the Bible is right, there's always a point of contact. There's always a way in, because these people do know and they don't know. They're looking and they're not looking. And so it's an encouragement to say we may have to excavate or dig around to find a kind of chink in the armor, but there will be one. I think, Adrian, the other thing that we find difficult, and this is where I think we do need to work on it, is in our apologetic, it's always trying to show how the gods that people worship, their ultimate commitments are failures, they're futile. So there's always an exposure, a kind of a critique, an attack in a gentle way, as it were. But there's still an uncovering that needs to be done to say, like in Jeremiah 2, when the prophet's talking about Israel, my people have committed two sins. They've turned to the fount of living water. They've turned from the fount of living water, and they've turned to cracked pots that cannot hold water. I think that's a great illustration, because we need to show people that who are thirsty that they're drinking out of a stagnant, cracked pot, and we have a fount of living water. Now they have to repent, they have to turn around from the pot. But we need to show people in all kinds of different ways that what they're doing will not last. You know, the person who feels a sense of great solidarity and oneness when a goal is scored at a football match, and they have that sense of elation, and they hug the person next to them that they've never seen before, it's so fleeting, because that someone is not going to talk to them when they've left the game, is not going to be self-sacrificial, but we're looking for that connection. And then to say something about our communion with the Lord, or church even, I mean, that's the important thing. Like the diversity. I mean, Christian community is meant to be the ultimate expression of community this side of the new heaven and the new earth. And how do we kind of point people to Christians loving each other who are very different is an amazing witness. So I think in lots of different ways, it's trying to kind of show the futility and the destructiveness of idolatry. I'll give one example. I'll give this example in the book. I was talking to a guy in Italy once who was coming out of he was in rehab for heroin addiction. And he was saying like, I could never follow Jesus because I wouldn't want anyone telling me what to do. And I did say to him I thought it was gentle. I said, what, you mean that heroin hasn't been telling you what to do? And he'd never made that connection that, you know, he was under authority. Because I think at baseline, we know we're created. We don't make good gods. And so we construct idols, but they're rubbish as well. I mean, that's the Isaiah 40 passage, isn't it? The idolater constructs the idol and it starts to topple. But we have to construct things to give us a sense of legitimacy. And so we need to show people that those idols, when an approaching menace comes, you know, which is that Isaiah passage, as Assyria comes, we need to show that the idols that people invest their lives in are destructive and disappointing. Now, how we do that is, you know, thousands of ways, but I think that's the kind of things that we need to be doing. Even just saying, you know, people are describing their lives and just asking them, how's that working for you? You know, yeah, as well as the stuff about loneliness. And, you know, we were talking about the sense of community and a sense of loneliness and isolation that people feel. How do we deal with that? I mean, so all this stuff on wellness and well-being and mental health, I mean, I think it's a great opportunity for us to be talking about the gospel.
Yes. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. The scheme is based on a Christian thought form. And I just wondered if it would be helpful to look at secular classification of human needs so that we're sort of starting where the world begins.
Yes, and do you mean as a kind of a help for the Christian, or just to start where some of the analysis goes? So, for example, in the book, I talk about Deliverance? I talk about this very influential book by the psychiatrist Steve Peters called The Chimp Paradox, which lots of Olympians have used, and he's like the sports psychiatrist du jour, where he talks about how we have this inner chimp within us that we need to control. In fact, at that point, it's really weird because the chimp isn't even you. But I do think, I mean, if that's what you're talking about, Martin, it's about, or Jordan, or, you know, the popularity of Jordan Peterson, 12 Ways to Live. I think that's a great opportunity because millions of people are reading this kind of material. And then I think there's overlap with what I'm saying, but also it's gospel, as in there's still a kind of an idolatrous way of it being expressed because of but it's suppressed truth because God's common grace is there. I mean, there's lots of common sense stuff about some of the Jordan Peterson stuff that I think is great. It's like it could be straight out of the wisdom books, but ultimately, without God, without the gospel, it is futile. But I think as a point of contact, if that's what you're talking about, then it's helpful. And I also think there's some stuff that's kind of not a mix of, but that then has very helpful stuff to say as well. But when you put it through the gospel framework, it might be tweaked a little bit. So whether it's secular models or even like in businesses as well. I mean, there's all this stuff on virtues and characteristics that big businesses. I mean, some of it is kind of. I once did this in class. Someone who worked for KPMG. I went to KPMG head offices once, and it's just full on the wall of people. It's like, you know, mantras for living, and we aspire to be this ethical company, etc., etc. And someone said to me, "Oh, I used to work at KPMG, and no one believes in that." But that's not the point. The point is, it's still seen to be important that firms are living up to these standards. Now, why is that? And I think there's lots of things we could say about why do we hold those values so important. And that's where I think some of the history comes in. You know, if you've read Tom Holland and Dominion, the things that we still cherish in a secularized society are the borrowed capital of Christian values. You know, human dignity that we hold was not the human dignity there in Roman or Greek times. They didn't believe in human worth in the way that Christianity has. So I think pointing that out to people as well. So I think there's a big mix there, Martin. So I think in terms of point of contact, yes. If you know, what are the books? What are the trends in psychiatry, psychology, wellness thinking that people are leadership that people are looking at, and then how do we take that and then put it through a kind of a gospel lens? And that will, I think, it will mean some exposure, uncovering, but it will also then show well, it's not completely alien to what we would want to say. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's what I meant. I didn't mean, you know, taking 10 easy steps to wealth as a substitute for the gospel.
No. I mean,
it might just open our eyes to what the world actually.
Oh, and yes, yeah. And because, you know, look, my magnetic book, not many people are going to read it. Millions of people are reading Jordan Peterson. Millions of people are watching his videos. Noah Harari, Sapiens, all of that stuff, you know, they're bestsellers. So we need to be reading. I mean, it's just the equivalent of Paul saying, as some of your poets say in Acts 17. I mean, that's all that it is. Who are these thinkers? Because they do have a lot of influence and we need to be engaging with them. Thank you. It's a really helpful question.
I'm going to cut in there because it is coming up to a few minutes before we close, and Think450's promises we are done in 50 minutes. So thank you so much, Dan. That's been fantastic. The video of this will be available if you kind of want to catch up, or if you came in late or want to share it around. Dan, do you want to just take 1 minute to tell us about anything Crosslands Forum are doing that we might be interested in?
Yeah, so Crosslands Forum exists for people like you. So we've got a lot of opportunities for you to engage in training wherever you're at, whether you're a young Christian through to whether you've thought about these things very, very deeply. A few things. We've got a cinema course starting next year called Sin Exegesis, where you can sign up, and as Christians will be in groups, we'll be looking at films together through the year. How do we analyze films from a Christian point of view that might be good for our discipleship and evangelism? That's called Sin Exegesis. It's on the Crosslands Forum website. I'm going to be leading a book group called Thinking Through Creation, which is looking at Genesis 1 to 3 and what are the patterns in Genesis that help us answer some of the biggest questions of the day. What does a biblical social theory look like? And there's a great book by a guy called Christopher Watkin called Thinking Through Creation. We've got a number of lectures on technology and issues. The writer Oliver O'Donovan, one of an ex-student of mine, is going to be talking about how his writing is helpful in the whole area of sexuality and gender. So there's all kinds of products on offer, and they're for you. I think I'm calling it continuing discipleship development and continuing ministerial development. We constantly need to be engaging, just as Martin was talking about. And we hope Crosslands Forum is there to serve the church and serve you. So please go to the website and sign up for some of these offerings. Thank you.
Thank you. The book is Making Faith Magnetic. I don't have a copy yet, so if you want to buy me one for Christmas, that would be gratefully received. We will have another Think450 in January. Nate Dawson, who works for IFE, is going to be talking about helping women in our churches to flourish and use their gifts to the max of their potential. She's done some writing on that, and we've got session on Proverbs lined up, hopefully shortly after that. So keep an eye on your emails for that. It is 12:50. This has been Think for 50. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you much, everyone else, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.